Mute that down. So fire tax revenues increase based on the annual CPI and population changes each year. In 2000, after voters passed a measure to increase the fire tax, it covered 86% of the contract cost. However, today it covers only 51%. This reduced the budget this year alone by over 1 million. As a full-service city with increasing pension costs and a large fire service contract with an insufficient revenue stream, the city is having to make difficult choices to divert funding for other services such as capital projects and infrastructure maintenance and staffing needs. As part of the subcommittee's work, they looked at annexation into the district. However, the subcommittee agreed this was suboptimal at this time until a more stable financing can be in place. The subcommittee also looked at potentially increasing the fire tax. With council's approval at their June 12th meeting, they engaged Team Civics to assist with this effort in determining the best alternative to address the fire tax revenue issue by conducting a feasibility assessment through polling of registered voters in Belvidere. The feasibility assessment was conducted from June 23rd through July 20th. The survey was conducted to help guide council's final decision whether to place a fire tax measure on the March 2024 ballot. This report will be posted on our website tomorrow. As we get into the polling analysis, it is important to clarify that the city also has a fire measure, which is separate from the fire tax established in 1980. As part of this separate measure, the city is required to ask voters to approve a budget ceiling override every 4 years to spend the fire tax revenues it receives per a requirement of California Prop 4. This measure does not increase taxes paid by Belvidere residents. It only allows us to spend the collected revenue. The current fire measure expires June 30th of 2024, and the renewal is due March of 2024. And at this time, I would like to introduce Charles Heath, partner at Team Civics, that is joining us this afternoon and will be presenting the results of the community survey. And I would like to propose that first we look at the survey results with Charles, and then secondly, focus on or discuss the fire contract and working with the district to update the contract for services. So at this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Charles.
Thank you, Helga. Good afternoon. My name is Charles Heath. I'm a partner with Team Civics. We've been working with the city for the last about 3 months to look at potential strategies for how we might be able to close this gap between the cost of providing fire and EMS services here in Belvidere and the revenues that you receive. What we've done recently is conducted a statistically reliable survey of the voters in your community in order to present to them potential options that might be placed on the ballot in the future and measure community support for those options. So what I'm going to do today is just walk you through the purpose of the study, some of the methodology behind it. We'll go through the various questions that were asked and the data that we collected. I'll talk about a few conclusions at the end, and then we can engage in conversation. Okay. So if you can go to the next slide, Helga. So I think as we've discussed at the highest level, the purpose of the survey is one, to determine is a measure feasible? And what I mean by that is if we were to put a tax measure before voters, would it stand a reasonable chance of achieving the 2/3 level of voter support that would be required for approval? Beyond that, we're also looking at the various components of a potential measure. So if we were to put this forward, how would we structure a measure to focus on the right service areas and the right tax rate in order to maximize voter support? But then also looking at how various messages related to this issue influence voter support, which would inform an outreach campaign to help voters understand the context for this issue. If we can go to the next slide. Digging into the methodology a little bit here, one of the challenges in your community, you only have 1,600 registered voters that live in about 800 households. That is a very small pool within which to conduct a statistically reliable survey. When we're doing work in Marin County or in larger cities within the county, we frequently conduct samples almost as large as your entire voting population. So This survey required a unique approach in order to make sure that we were maximizing the participation rates and gathering sufficient data to draw accurate conclusions from. So the way the survey methodology works is we start by looking at your registered voter pool, and within that, who is likely to vote in an upcoming election. And since we were thinking about potentially putting a measure on the ballot in either the primary or general election in 2024, we basically modeled past voter participation in Belvidere and looked at the participation rate among different demographic groups. And then we pulled together the full contact information for all of those registered voters and recruited participation via a number of different means. Really, the only means that are available to us, or all of the means that are available to us. There was a direct mail piece that was sent to every single household that fit that criteria, with an invitation to participate in the survey and a unique PIN number for the voters in that household. And the purpose of that unique PIN number is to make sure that a voter can't complete multiple surveys and stack the deck, so to speak. We also sent emails to registered voters for whom we had email addresses for to invite participation in the survey. That also included a link and a unique PIN number, again, to make sure that each voter could only complete the survey once. We also sent text messages to those voters that we had cell phone numbers for. That linked through also to that same online survey where they could enter their PIN number and complete the survey. And then lastly, for those voters that didn't respond to one of the other opportunities to complete the survey, we made telephone calls to both landlines and cell phone numbers and administered the survey via telephone. Based on that, we were able to achieve 261 completed interviews, which is a relatively large sample size for a community of your size. And the statistics that are derived from that is that we can be confident that the results we're going to look at today are within at least plus or minus 5.5 percentage points of the results we would have received had we talked to every single Belvidere voter, basically conduct a census of your community. So, so as we're looking at the data here, imagine, it could be 5 points lower, could be 5 points higher than the numbers that we're looking at. And go to the next slide, Helga. Okay, so starting to dig into the questions that were asked, we always open up a survey like this with some warm-up questions, get them thinking about local issues and the issues that they're concerned about in their local community. We started with a question here just asking voters to rate the overall quality of life in Belvidere. Would you say it's excellent, good, fair, poor, or very poor? And these are probably the highest levels of satisfaction with quality of life that I've seen in any community in California. 97% rated the quality of life here as excellent or poor. Very, very small numbers of people saying poor and really nobody, or sorry, saying fair and nobody saying poor or very poor. So people are very satisfied with their quality of life here in Belvidere, which when you're looking at a tax measure can be a double-edged sword. There's a high degree of satisfaction. People don't perceive significant problems that might be threatening their quality of life, which can create impediments to asking for additional local funding. If you go to the next slide, Helga. We dug deeper into that question and asked if city government could change one thing to make Belvidere a better place to live now and in the future, what would you like to see? This is uncommon, but the most frequent, and this was an open-ended question, right? We didn't prompt them with individual responses. We asked them in their own words to tell us what they would change about the city. The number one response we received was no changes are really needed, everything is fine. That is very unusual. I guarantee if we asked that question in San Francisco or Oakland, we'd hear a lot about homelessness and crime and any number of other issues, but no changes are necessary. As you look down the list there, there's a variety of other issue areas that are, being brought up by, 10% or less of the population. Not an overwhelming issue of importance that we'll often see emerge that, is a concern of, a quarter or a half of your population. And also, as you look down that list, you'll notice that fire, emergency services, 911 emergency response isn't rising to, isn't really registering in the list. So it doesn't suggest that, at least as a top of mind issue, that concerns about the vulnerability of emergency response and fire protection is a top of mind voter for Belvidere residents.
What's the axis on the bottom? Is that people?
Those are percentages of respondents.
So 13.9 of 261 people voted for no changes. Is that right?
Correct. You'll notice also that 4 items down, not sure, can't think of anything specific, was an additional 8%. right? So I think, you know, here you're looking with sort of directional indications from the data, and this is suggesting there's a whole lot of satisfaction and complacency with the way things are currently in Belvedere. Like I said, in contrast to the data that we see in other Bay Area communities, this is radically different. Can we go to the next slide? There we go. Okay. The next question drilled down more specifically in satisfaction with government. And the question was, generally speaking, are you satisfied or dissatisfied with the job the city of Belvedere is doing to provide city services? Obviously, there's a correlation with people's confidence in government and how they might vote on additional funding for those services. And what we found here is also generally high satisfaction rates. We saw that 39% said that they were very satisfied. An additional 46% said that they were very somewhat satisfied. So that's a total of 85% saying that they were satisfied on some level. Those are very high numbers. Oftentimes, especially in the current environment, it'll be much more likely 60-40, satisfied to dissatisfied. But here we're seeing the overwhelming majority of your voters are satisfied with current city services. And, you know, as I mentioned, that is a great thing on one level. People are happy with what you're providing, but it also creates a challenge when you're asking for funding for enhancements and improvements of revenue for certain services. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, this is where we dig into the proposed fire measures specifically. And what we do is relatively early in the survey, before we started talking about the issue in any depth, is we want to get an initial read on support for a potential measure. And this sort of simulates what would happen if people were asked to walk into a voting booth today and vote on the measure just based on what they already know, right? We're not pre-populating their head with information about the issue, just based on what you know today, how might you vote? And then what you'll see in the subsequent questions in the survey is we start introducing more information and we see how that influences support over time, which kind of simulates how support might be influenced by future communication. So working with city staff, we developed this draft ballot question. This complies with all the laws that would be required if you were to put a measure on the ballot. It is 75 words, which was required. It includes the tax rate, the duration, all the legally required components. The bullet points that you'll see at the top of the slide there kind of summarize some of the key potential benefits that would be derived from the measure. And then after either reading this question to voters or having them read it themselves in an online survey, we asked them, if the election were held today, how would you vote? Yes or no on the measure. And if we go to the next slide, what we saw is about 41% of people said that they would vote yes. Once they said yes, we drilled down. Is that definitely yes or probably yes? And we saw that there was a mix there. But obviously the 41% is well below the 2/3 threshold that would be required for passage of a measure. About 42% saying that they would oppose the measure, and about 16% saying that they are unsure. One of the things that I will point out is that the tax rate that we tested in this survey was $980 per residential unit. That would be on top of the existing fire tax, so substantial tax increase. Oftentimes we see that when you're talking about a substantial tax increase of that nature, we get a little bit of sticker shock, and that's why you see some pushback on the proposal and lower support levels like we're seeing here.
Charles, real quick.
Yeah.
Can you talk about were respondents told that it's an increase? Was there any dialogue along those lines, or just describe how you described the increase, or whether it was just a 980 period?
No, it was the language that we saw on that prior slide that simulates the ballot question. Because again, imagine you walk into a voting booth, you're asked to vote on this. You may know you're already paying for a fire tax, you may not. So we're
So it was at this point pretty quiet about previous tax.
correct. And you'll see in a minute how we start introducing that kind of information to see how that influences people. So if we can go to the next slide, Helga. So from here, we wanted to dig into the tax rate issue to see, is that really what seems to be the impediment? And we tested a range of rates from $980 per residential unit at the high end, down to $498 per residential unit on the low end. And that would cover, and correct me if I'm wrong, Helga, you're the expert on this, anywhere from fully funding your fire services to roughly making up roughly half of the shortfall that currently exists. And, you know, again, when we drill people down, $980, now we've taken them from that ballot question that is a mix of the benefits and the costs to now we're kind of putting the blinders on the voter, focusing them on the cost. We see support go down a little further to 38%. When we drop the tax rate to $740 per residential unit per year, support climbs a little bit to 41%. And when we go all the way down to roughly $500 per year, $498, we gain a little bit, but we're still, you know, barely reaching a simple majority level. So still far below the 2/3 mark. My reading of this is because we led with such an aggressive tax rate, almost $1,000 per parcel, there's a lot of voters that sort of turned off to the concept at that point, and it's hard to get them to warm back up to the concept even as you drop the tax rate. So as we'll talk about in a minute here, I think a more modest tax rate is certainly going to be the key to achieving future funding for this, but it's going to have to be at a substantially lower rate than the range we were looking at here, because we're not in the range of 2/3 here. If we go to the next slide. So the next set of questions in the survey looked at the potential uses of funds. Now, it's a little tricky in this instance because oftentimes we're talking about funding a new service and it's very clear exactly what those dollars would go towards. Here, we're looking to offset a contract cost, right? And all the things that are encompassed in that contract. And so you can see that the items that are listed here attempt to sort of break down the key services that are provided as part of that contract. But the other piece of this is that it's the other areas of the general fund budget that are impacted by the subsidy, right, that the general fund's having to make up. So we also had to introduce that complicated concept that this isn't just about funding the fire contract. This is also about helping to preserve other services that are being encroached on because of that subsidy. And we read each of these items individually and basically asked voters, if you heard that money from this measure was going to be used for this purpose, would it make you more likely or more favorable or less favorable to supporting the measure? And these are in rank order based on the highest priorities that voters told us. At the top of the list was providing emergency medical, paramedic, and ambulance services 24 hours a day. That's a pretty common high priority for voters. Replacing outdated firefighting and life-saving equipment and supplies, providing quick responses to 911 emergencies, providing fire protection and prevention services 24 hours a day, providing emergency communications and dispatch. So all of those kind of core 911 response, fire protection services are the highest priorities for your voters. Beyond that, kind of in the middle of the pack, we see that avoiding cuts to other services provided by the city, including police, crime prevention, and street maintenance. It's a priority, but not as high a priority as kind of those 911 and fire related items. So typically the way we use this data is in developing a measure and understanding how to present it to voters, but also developing the communication about the measure. This helps us understand what their priorities are and how we frame the issue, focusing on the right issues. So this tells me that, voters understand how this impacts police services and street maintenance, other services, but it's a little bit of a complicated story to tell. And they resonate more strongly with the kind of straightforward presentation of this is about 911 emergencies and fire, right? So that's just a strategic challenge you have in telling the story that has this additional element that impacts other services directly. And if we can go to the next slide. So now we've described the measure, we've described how much it might cost, presenting a range of different rates. We've presented the items that the measure might fund, both emergency services related and non-emergency services related. And now we go into a section where we present information. This is meant to simulate the kind of discussion and debate that would occur if a measure were placed on the ballot. So these are a series of messages that voters might hear over the course of a campaign, in the community as voters were considering this issue. And what we're trying to do here is simulate first what proponents of the measure might say, and then in a minute you'll see we simulate what opponents of the measure might say, so that we can estimate what support might be at the end of that campaign cycle. So, and I won't go through in these in detail. You'll receive all this to go through yourself. But the most persuasive argument in favor of the measure is the notion that in 1980, voters approved a fire tax to pay for full-time professional fire and emergency medical services. Over time, the cost of providing these services increased to a point where the fire tax just covers half the cost of the services. So just a basic explanation of the nature of the issue and what's driving this. The next most persuasive message was that fast emergency response times for 911 calls are critical for saving lives. This measure will ensure that we have the firefighters, police officers, dispatchers, and paramedics needed to respond quickly to 911 emergencies. And the third item here is just a matter of local control. All money raised by the measure will be used to fund fire protection and emergency medical services here in Belvidere. By law, it can't be taken away by the state or used for other purposes. So that kind of accountability protection that the money is going to stay here locally was persuasive to your voters. What we're really interested here is after we've presented this litany of positive arguments to voters, how much does it move the needle to the positive, right? And if we go to the next slide here, basically we retest that same ballot question with the $980 per residential unit tax rate. And what we find here is that we gain a little bit of support. We go from 41% to 45%. But again, we're not in the conversation for a measure requiring a 2/3 vote. And again, I think that's largely because the tax rate is just a hurdle that we're not getting over, even with all this messaging. People are perceiving this to be just too expensive and more that they're willing to pay given their satisfaction with services and quality of life in the community. Sort of buried within the language of the measure, there's a component that we wanted to make sure voters understood. And Helga, if you'll go to the next slide. And that is that in addition to asking to increase the tax rate by up to $980 per residential unit, there was also a component in this that would increase the annual cost of living adjustment from the current level, which is CPI, the rate of inflation, to a number that would more fairly represent the annual increase in the cost of the contract. So we clarified for voters to say that local funding for fire and emergency medical service in Belvidere has not kept pace with the cost of providing these services, which is why the city has had to cut other services and is facing additional cuts in the future. To solve this problem, the cost of the proposed measure would adjust annually by up to 6% to ensure that fire and emergency medical services are fully funded now and protected from cuts in the future. Knowing this, would you vote yes or no on the measure? And you can see here, we were at 45% just a minute ago when we tested the ballot question. When we clarify that this comes with a 6% cost of living adjustment annually, that support that we had gained is erased and we're back down to 41%. So that notion of the cost of living escalator is a net negative. So from here in the survey, we've tested the positive side of the coin. Now we're going to test the negative side of the coin. What happens when voters hear potential arguments against a measure? If you can go to the next slide, Helga. So same methodology here. We read voters a list of different arguments that they might hear from potential opponents of the measure. We utilized messages that we frequently hear from sort of anti-tax voices. And we also thought about your Measure D campaign last year and some of the arguments that were used in that campaign so that we're accurately reflecting some of the local nuances. And what we found is that the number one argument against the measure is that property owners are already paying a fire tax, right? So now it's made clear to them that this is on top of what they're already paying, as well as other multiple taxes, bonds, and assessments. Now they want us to pay for another fire tax, for another tax for fire protection. Enough is enough. We can't afford to keep raising our taxes. That was the primary argument against the measure. Others included just cost of living. Our community is already an expensive place to live, especially for young families, seniors, and those on fixed incomes. Passing this tax will make it even less affordable. And then also the notion that there's no expiration date on this tax, will last forever. That was a negative as well. So this is really meant to reveal the potential vulnerabilities for a measure, but then also to see what cumulative impact a negative campaign would have. And if you go to the next slide, Helga. So again, here now voters have heard the positives and the negatives. We go back to that ballot question. We ask them how they would vote, and now we're at 44%. So again, in all told, we've moved the needle by approximately 5 percentage points. But this suggests to me that the collective strength of the messaging that we're testing here and by telling this story isn't enough to get you within the ballpark of 2/3. So if we can go to the last slide here, I'll just summarize some of the conclusions, and I've talked about some of this as we've gone. Unfortunately, we're just not seeing that this proposal is going to be embraced by 2/3 of your voters, at least in the current environment. So, I think there's a couple of different approaches you might want to take. One is take a close look at that tax rate. It took 23 years since the last time this measure was increased to sort of create the current problem. It sounds as though a sort of one step fix the whole problem in one go approach probably isn't going to be digestible for your voters. So maybe a more incremental approach where you either adjust the cost of living adjustment initially, then maybe adjust the tax rate marginally over time. That might be a way to solve the problem, but clearly something in the $500 to $1,000 range is just outside the tolerance level of your voters currently. Also, I also want to highlight some of those early findings from the surveys, which is that voters are overwhelmingly satisfied with the community. Voters typically understand that a no vote means that we're going to maintain the status quo. And when they like the status quo, they're going to gravitate towards the status quo and that no vote. So I definitely think that it would be beneficial for the city to engage in a sustained communication effort to make sure voters understand what's at stake here, right? A no vote isn't just the status quo, it's actually over the long term a diminishment of services, right? I mean, something's going to have to be cut if the contract continues to encroach on your ability to fund other items. And that's something that needs to be understood. So, I think through those communication efforts and looking at a more modest proposal, that's likely the way forward here. But unfortunately, we're not seeing viability for something that fixes the problem in the near term. And I would just also highlight, as Helga mentioned in her introductory remarks, given that in order to keep collecting your existing fire tax, you do need that appropriations limit override. I mean, that seems like the most urgent and important objectives to make sure you continue collecting what you're already receiving, and not let that be complicated by mixed feelings about this potential increase. So it seems like taking care of that first would be the first order of business. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions about the poll or our conclusions.
Charles, I've got a question. As I followed the presentation, if I understood what you said correctly, is that the individuals being surveyed were first to ask, would you be willing to pay $900 something for this service? I mean, you're the expert in this, so I don't pretend there's any particular intelligence to the question I'm going to ask, but it seems to me the average voter who in his mind says, well, I already got that service, why would I pay $980, would say no.
Yep.
And then as you got further through the service, you presented arguments for and against. The problem with the arguments for is that the arguments for kind of sound like, well, some people will think this, some won't. And it never gave them the real facts of why in the world would I be asked to say yes to a tax for a service I already have.
Mm-hmm.
And would influence them toward continuing to say no. Once you say no in a survey, you're a little more reluctant to change your mind. Tell me what's fallacious about that line of reasoning.
I mean, I think it's a reasonable interpretation of the results. The challenge we have is, well, there's a couple of challenges. One is, unlike most tax proposals here, the services that the tax funds aren't necessarily what's at stake, right? And so that's just fundamentally simplicity is your friend in elections like this, right? Just having a straightforward proposal that voters can digest quickly is really important. And that's just not the nature of this, which is why we're kind of having to do this dancing act to, well, this is really about fire and emergency services, but the services that are at risk are these other services, right? That's just, it's a challenging reality. You're right that the messages were presented as here are things proponents might say and here are things opponents might say. I mean, that's the reality of how information comes out. And there's no independent arbiter that tells you these are the facts and these are the falsehoods, right? So this is meant to represent how information comes out. Now, the city has an opportunity to communicate factual information. Here's the reality of our budget. Here's what might happen if we don't achieve additional funding for these services. Some people trust the city as an information source, other people don't. So I still think it's reasonable and relevant to present the information as some people say this, some people say that, because if you read the newspaper, that's how it's presented, right? Balanced stories, if you're lucky.
Charles, I have a question. Did you cover the polling results for question 14, which was rating the job of managing the financial resources of the city?
We didn't specifically have a slide on that, but that will be in the full results they're shared with you. Sorry, I don't have the full question here with me. Real quick. Yeah, so in your opinion, has the city of Belvedere done an excellent, good, fair, or poor, or very poor job managing its financial resources? 16% said excellent, 35% said good, 23% fair. So that's about, roughly 50% saying excellent or good. Those are reasonably positive numbers. 6% said poor and 5% said very poor. So 11% were on the negative side. So it's about 5-to-1 positive to negative.
So I don't know how to apply all these numbers, but I can add. And so if you had 51% say that the job of managing financial resources is excellent or good, that's lower than the 85% that are either very satisfied or somewhat satisfied with the services.
Sure.
So that might relate somewhat to what Chairman McCaskill was asking about and we've been talking about as far as if you're satisfied with the services, why do you want to pay for this? And it's a complicated thing to explain, but there's a gap in those high level numbers of being confident that the dollars are being best spent.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. And we frequently ask questions about satisfaction and services in tandem with questions about satisfaction with fiscal management. There's almost always a drop, and there's a stereotype government misspends money. And so you're typically going to see a drop in those regardless of how good the city does in managing its resources. But there's definitely room here to build confidence and build trust in the city's fiscal management, which I think would only help.
So you said that the 85% was an outlier. How is the gap between the 85 and 51? Or is the 51 an outlier? Or put that in context of your other
comparison to other cities, and we've done similar research for other cities and are in here recently. The numbers related to the fiscal management are pretty close to the norm. The 85% satisfaction of city services is an outlier. That's off the chart. So by virtue of that, there's going to be a gap, right? There's, as I mentioned, there's relatively low numbers of people with a negative opinion of fiscal management here in the city. There's more a combination of a small majority of people that think things are going well, a lot of people that don't have an answer to the question, which is natural. Most voters don't follow the city budget, but they have an intuitive sense of our service is adequate. Any other questions?
I suppose the one that comes to my mind is, and maybe this goes beyond the type of advice that your firm would normally give, but if you were to believe that this is a tax that sooner or later we're going to have to raise one way or the other. It's a small city, and at some point you just can't pay for the services we provide. Would your suggestion be that over some period of time, next 2 to 4 years, is that the city try to educate its voters about the challenges that are going to be faced by the city council because of the shortcoming, and then try it again, do another survey when hopefully voters have a better understanding of, well, why they even asking me about this?
Yeah, I think that's generally the right approach, but just to kind of take it a level deeper, as I mentioned, initially you need the appropriations limit override just to continue collecting the full amount of your current tax. So I think March of 2024 is your next opportunity to do that, and it makes sense to do that. That probably needs a communication effort to make clear that this is not a tax increase. This is just collecting a tax that's already been approved by our voters. From there, yes, I think communication to help the community understand the reality of the situation is critical. But part of that, I think, is making the reality of the cuts that would be required as real as possible, right? I understand that the cuts that would be required here would probably fall heaviest on your police department, just because that's a place that you have room to cut. So, what are the realistic alternatives there? Is it outsourcing your police department? Is it going to a part-time police department? Is it further reducing your existing department? I think a thorough study of that and communicating the results of that study will help Belvidere voters understand this is real, and there are real consequences unless we address that. I think that's the piece that's kind of missing today, is that people don't feel the reality of the situation and what may be at stake. With those pieces in place, then I think it's when you can look at whether it's 2026 or another election coming back. But even in that instance, I think you're probably looking at an incremental fix to the problem, not a one-stop solution to the problem. Because I just don't, based on this data, and albeit this is in the current environment, current economy, all of those qualifiers, I don't think a $1,000 tax or even a $500 tax is likely in play at the 2/3 level.
If the city were to not actively do anything to try to educate voters further about the issue that was being asked about here, is there a risk 2 years from now when the ballot contains this override measure, which we have to do every 4 years, that some meaningful percentage of the voters might think that it's this issue here they're voting on and vote no on it?
Absolutely, which is why I would do this in sequence. And between now and March of 2024, which is only 8 months now, I would focus on the appropriations limit override component, right? And make real clear that this is just about collecting taxes that have already been approved. This does not constitute a tax increase. That vote is only a simple majority, so you have a much lower threshold, right? So I think the risks associated with that with lower. Once you get past the appropriations limit override, I think that would be the time to launch a more focused communications effort and the study of impacts on police services and all that I mentioned, so that you can sort of disentangle those two issues, right? And make sure voters are focused on the appropriations limit override first, and then look at increasing funding in the longer term.
Charles,
Yeah, I would think, sorry, Sally, you're first.
can I just ask, with polling that you're doing for other potential ballot measures, is it also sluggish generally across Marin right now because of higher taxes and inflation and economic environment, or this is very specific to this community?
The margin by which you're below the passage threshold is unique to Belvidere. I haven't seen survey results this negative in any other community in California this year, and I've probably looked at 50 or more similar polls,
Okay.
Including probably a half dozen here in Marin. Support levels for tax measures and bond measures generally is down marginally from what we typically see. And I think that's a function of the last couple of years of inflation, increasing cost of living, frustrations with crime and homelessness, and some of the issues that are out there in the community. People are just sort of in a negative mood at the moment. But that's, shaving off maybe 3 to 5 percentage points from what we would normally see, not being, 25+ percentage points shy of the passage threshold.
And I guess the other question I have, and I know this well, I don't know the answer to this actually. Because it is such a small sample size, and we have some members of the community that are very invested, is there a chance that this survey has more bias potentially than others, because there's lots of people who are on the outside and some people who are either negatively or positively on the inside who are more incentivized to take the survey? Or is that true of every community?
No, there's a greater risk of that in a smaller community, definitely. I mean, part of the challenges with survey research of this nature is that it relies on the motivation of the respondent, right? And, you know, if I'm surveying 20 million voters in Los Angeles County, people will randomly opt in and out the survey, and I have a big enough pool to make sure that it's a truly random survey. Here, because we have such a small pool, the, you know, individual's motivation to take the survey comes into play. But still, we have over 200 completed interviews here, so it would take a pretty significant number of people that were motivated to take the survey, other than just I'm interested in responding about issues in my community, to really skew the results this dramatically. So that might be, you know, worth 5 to 10 percentage points, but it's not a 25 percentage point skew.
Thanks.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I don't have any comments on the survey, other than I do think it may, as you implied, tilt the balance against just simply doing the measure that we need to do, because people will confuse it with increasing the tax. So I think the necessity of educating the voting public has been exacerbated by the survey. And we've already seen Rothman put out a cartoon saying this is typical, putting the tax before any explanation. But putting that to one side, I do think that you know, an extensive, thoughtful campaign to educate people about the dilemma that we face and the squeeze that's going to happen on our general budget is required. I also think that we've dropped off the table the idea of incorporating with the Tiburon Fire Department. We had a meeting on it before I resigned. We seemed to be fairly open-ended, and I would have thought it would be useful to have a direct dialogue with the Tiburon Fire Department, because there's an underlying issue, you know, which is explained in the staff report very clearly, about the cost of the fire department going up on autopilot because Tiburon's property tax goes up by more than inflation, or more than the index we have. So, you know, there's a fundamental problem. I don't know where that dialogue would go, but I would think we'd want to have an informal conversation with people to see if that's a possibility, because that would fix the problem permanently. It doesn't alleviate the financial, which is sort of moving money from one bucket to another, but you fix the problem. And, you know, that may take 2 years, but something that takes 2 years is worth starting straight away rather than just pushing it aside on assumptions. So I think that's another avenue that we could pursue simultaneously with trying to explain to the public why we have a problem. Lastly, I don't think I would link this to the police department. I mean, a lot of the budget is fungible. It's not particularly the police department's budget, it's more fungible than anything else. So, you know, I think it's a bit of a red herring. And again, it'll be like Measure D, where we bring up things and then back off them later on. So the sort of threat of a part-time police doesn't do it for me. And it's probably something we're going to have to back off later on anyway, because I don't see that as any more fungible than other parts of the general budget. So those are my thoughts.
Other questions, comments for Charles? Charles, thank you.
Sure.
We appreciate your help with this. Is there anything, Helga or Robert, is there anything specific at this point that you believe the Finance Committee should be addressing in response to this? I mean, we can have a general discussion about our reactions to it, but is it beyond that? Is there any particular issue that either staff or the city council thinks that this committee should be addressing?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Good question. I just want to make the note, we do have one hand raised in the audience if you want to answer that question, public comment. But in general, yeah, I think that what we're hoping to get today is just a discussion about, where do we go from here? And are there recommendations about, do we wait in terms of the communication plan, hold off until, as Charles suggested, after March, focus on our current tax and educating the community around that, and then do more community outreach following March, city council meetings talking about either cuts to certain departments or services like road maintenance, so we can address some of these short-term and long-term shortfalls. But other than that, I don't think necessarily we're looking for any direct feedback or a direct recommendation from the Finance Committee today.
Okay. Discussion from members of the Finance Committee?
Regarding the survey specifically.
Yep.
Yeah.
Any comments or discussions? Sally?
So I have a few thoughts. I mean, so I have a few takeaways from the survey. And one of them is just that people are sick of taxes. And that was very clear in the survey. And when Helga and I look back through all of the tax measures that Belvedere residents have seen in the last decade, and just in the last decade, there's been 8 new tax measures for Belvedere residents, and none of them are from the city of Belvedere. They're all from education, MMWD, the county, various other things. So I think the challenge that we face is that our citizens are getting lots of new taxes. We have only one tax on our residents, and that's the existing fire tax, which is over 20 years old. But it's hard to get past, I think, this view that people have justifiably that their taxes are really high and they keep having new taxes foisted on them. So I think that's one of my first takeaways. The second, which we didn't discuss, is that we also look back through the history of measures in Belvedere. And one thing I hadn't known until a couple of days ago is that in 1992, I think it was, there was a failed attempt to increase the fire tax. So although they increased it in 2000, the city council tried to increase it in 1992 and failed. So it does strike me that this is a process where citizens need to get to the point of understanding the impact on their other services from the increased burden of fire on other services, from eating away at services. So I think this is a long haul rather than a yes or no today. I think it's a process, and we need to eventually get there, because eventually we'll just be out of money. I do think the focus on the police department is justified, because when you look through the numbers in terms of headcounts for other departments, we're basically down to 1 in every single department. So unless you're planning to eliminate any other department, I should rephrase that, we're down to minimum staffing levels, not necessarily 1, but it would be there's no fat to cut in other departments. So if we're talking about cutting headcount, the only place to look at that realistically is the police department. And so that would likely involve evaluating shared services with Tiburon or some other kind of structure, because eventually we will reach the point where we cannot fund those 5 police officers plus the police chief. So I do think that's a valid focus. And I think the focus on lack of infrastructure spending is also a valid focus, because again, on a trend basis, that's where we cut. When our pension burden is going up and the impact of the fire burden is going up, we have to cut somewhere. And the cuts have been headcount across the board, infrastructure investment and roads, etc. And now more recently, the police, because that was the last to go. So I don't know how much emphasis there should be on police, but we can't run away from it, because that is where the service cuts are going to happen. And I guess the final point I'd make is, I do think it's important to stress through this process that our finances are not in terrible condition. We've always managed our finances really well. On a sort of our 5-year plan, we're still meeting our goals. And we still have factored in 5 police officers. So this is really a medium-term issue. But it is something that we do need to start educating our community on, and certainly they're not there today in wanting a tax increase. But as services get cut, and they will over time, one would hope that they will get to the point of seeing the value in increasing taxes. And then just finally on annexation, we did meet with LAFCO during the subcommittee meeting and had long conversations around that. And I think the point being, we could annex into Tiburon Fire Protection District, but we would have to give an increasing share of our budget over time for in perpetuity to do that today. And so that doesn't solve any problems. And the only thing we get from annexation in the Tiburon Fire Protection District is potentially one seat on a 5-person board. And so that doesn't create a lot of value to me. And if you look how they would allocate costs, it would almost certainly be in relation to use of service. And so we would be, they're not going to cut us a deal and let us pay less. They're going to give us a fair assessment of the cost of services. And we can't afford to annex in. So I don't know that conversation is useful now, but I do think a conversation over time with Tiburon Fire Protection District to look at our contract is really valid, because it's 20 years old and the apportionment formula to me isn't necessarily as fair as it should be. So I do think that should be an immediate step, but I don't think I think discussions of annexation right now are a bit of a red herring.
Yeah, let me just respond, because I brought both points up. One, this sort of correlation that Sally's drawing between this increase in the police, I think is not sound. We can cut other things. It would be awful to cut other things, but we're perfectly capable of cutting other things. It's not like we have to cut headcount, cut capital expenditure, we can cut all sorts of things. So, I don't want to put something up that we can't defend. And then on the annexation, a lot of it is supposition. No one's actually had a conversation with them about the formula, about the annexation, how it would be structured. It's all, well, they wouldn't do this, they wouldn't do that, they wouldn't do this. I'd have a conversation with them, rather than base everything on assumptions. I don't see a downside of it. I can't reject a sort of fundamental resolution of the problem based on unsupported assumptions. They may be logical, but a lot of things in the world, a lot of things we deal with aren't driven by logic.
I think when we met with, what was the guy named Jason Freed from LAFCO, I think the discussion,
for that.
But the discussion there was in terms of how it would be apportioned, and it would almost certainly be on a services basis. And when you look at the other annexations that have happened in fire departments throughout Marin, that's typically been the formula. So I just don't see why Tiburon Fire Protection District would give us a break.
Well, my reading of that, I was in that meeting, was not the same as yours. So I think we differ on that. I think he said that there are many options and avenues to follow, but you can't follow any of them unless you start a dialogue. So I didn't come out of that discussion with the same conclusion at all.
On a different issue, Sally, the fact you mentioned about that there had been a proposal in the 1990s that was to increase the fire tax formula that had been voted down. And then in the year 2000, it was passed. Robert, is there any chance that we could dig into our files to find out as much information about what happened between those two dates? Not only how did the city go about changing the mind of the population, because by the year 2000, they got a 96% yes vote. So something must have happened. It'd be interesting to see, and we might learn something from that. But I'm also a little curious as to if we have anything in the city's files about how did they, the city council arrive at the somewhat change in the formula with the fire department? Um, and I think I tend to agree with John. It doesn't hurt to talk to the fire department and see if there isn't some things we can tweak. I don't think that's going to fix the big problem, but in this environment, every dollar counts. And so, and I do think we probably have a little bit of leverage with them, is because they would hate to see us leave. But they're also smart enough to know there may not be any way we
Yeah.
could leave. So it's
So,
a
so,
double-edged sword.
so I agree entirely that we should definitely have an ongoing conversation with Tiburon Fire Protection District to look at our current contract as a bare minimum, and have, maybe it's an independent arbiter come in to look at the current formula to see if that's fair, because looking at the data in terms of the amount of service calls we get, we're overpaying a little bit. And so I think that should happen. My understanding, but Helga, remind me, in terms of annexation, that conversation is a pretty expensive conversation, or you have to bring in outside consultants to do all of those things. Can you?
So what Jason Freed said was that, you know, when Southern Marin and Mill Valley came together, it cost about 60,000, and that would be on the high end for us to do the annexation.
Right.
And so the two agencies split that cost, so it's around 30,000 each, but ours would be less. And that it'd be like, instead of 2 years that it took them to come to an agreement, it'd be like 9 to 12 months for us.
Yeah, so I don't think cost is a factor, given where we are. But Bob, I agree with you about looking at the formula, but based on what I saw, even if you got a favorable result, it's not going to solve the problem.
Right.
Yeah, because we got like 50%, 50%. I mean, we've got $1 million problem.
Yep.
Tweaking the formula might give you 50,000 or 100,000. It's not going to give you a million. So, but I agree with Helga about the cost of exploring the annexation, and the time frame is not prohibitive. It's just a decision, and we seem to be making decisions on assumptions rather than actual discussions. I'm not sure it'd go anywhere. They go to a roadblock. Who knows? But I'm not in a position to make a judgment, and it seems weird that we take it off the table. Other than that, I think you have to go where we have a problem, I think, is that there are a lot of other taxes going up simultaneously. We sort of have a Measure D hangover. And that's not a terrific background. So we have you might learn something from 1990, but the context is so different. We have a very tough hill to climb.
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind, if it were not for Measure D, the results of the survey would have been dramatically different.
Yeah.
So I have a couple observations and a question or two. I looked back 14 years on the percentage of that was being made up of the cost of the fire contract versus the portion that was paid from the general revenues. And 14 years ago, it was 58% was covered by the tax, and today 51%. So it is a slow burn, but we do have time along those lines. And as far as the tying it to the police, I would tend to agree more with John. I understand the head count, but there are capital expenditures, and I think that's putting too fine a point on it. As far as the contract can always be improved, I'm somewhat surprised that we're not sending somebody to the fire board meetings. We have the right to have a representative sit with the board and without even this particular matter, I think the fact that it's a $2 million contract and means a lot to the citizens of Belvedere. And this is outside of the area of finance, but I would think we would attend those meetings with a representative. And then my understanding of the history, going back to 1980 and 81, was that there was an organization, the Southern Marin Paramedic System. And while that was a separate organization, part of the fire department to some degree, I guess it existed until the late 90s. And I think they billed insurance companies for services, and this is getting off the subject, but it's the big subject of reviewing this and taking our time. And it's something that does need to be addressed. I think everyone agrees with that. And I don't even know if the whole medical world, insurance world changed over those 40 years, or if the Tiburon Fire Protection District even bills insurance companies for these services. But apparently that was happening 40 years ago.
Yeah, so there is the Southern Marin Emergency Paramedic System, and so Tiburon Fire contracts with them, and they provide the paramedic and hospital transport services, and they do the billing through a third-party administrator. So they,
All right, so that's in place, and there's no additional funding there.
Well, I still think it's a question worth asking. You may discover they are not very vigorous in that billing, because whatever they don't get that way, they know they'll get from the Tiburon Fire Department. I don't know how their contract works, but that's always a possibility.
Fair enough. And I have one question on the override, and maybe it's in the materials, but if the override was not approved, what portion of the 1.1 million for the current year budget is contingent on the override? Is that a bad question?
It's a great question. That's a conversation that we're having right now, because we believe we might be able to bring some of the current override into the general budget so that that portion is smaller, because right now it is nearly $1 million of it, and we think we might be able to bring it down to about 600,000. But if the measure were to fail next March, and it's always passed by 80% plus margin, if that were to fail us, we understand that we can collect the tax for another year, but we can't spend it. And then eventually we have to give it back, but it would just mean immediate aggressive cuts to services.
that's correct.
Thank you. And in concluding, I would like to thank the staff and everyone on the subcommittee for meeting and preparing all this material. It was very helpful. And sooner or later, this will need to be pursued.
Yeah, I think we have to have a pretty clear communication / recommendation that there's no new tax proposed. I mean, I think that needs to be pretty clear recommendation going forward. And I think, as Charles is pointing out, a lot of this, it can't just be behind the scenes. It has to be communicated publicly and out there as much as possible, because we've already been out there with this. We've already had this proposal, and we don't want this to influence other necessary courses of our business, specifically the override coming up. So your comment about what this override means and how that specifically, it's not an authorization to collect the tax, but to actually spend it in some form or fashion. I think that needs to be communicated, up through the city council and as much as we possibly can, so that when fourth quarter to first quarter, we start to talk about, by we, I mean hopefully a independent committee looking to promote this tax and promote this override, not a tax, the override, can be very specific about it. Listen, this is an existing tax. We're not looking to change anything. Everything you may have heard, we probably don't want to talk about that, but we want the message to be that everything you might have already heard, this isn't that. This is clearly just the same tax, looking at it going forward. I also think, John touched on this a little bit, but I think going forward, we're also faced with this isn't the right use of terms, but a micro versus macro issue, in that we're looking at our budget, how the services cost relates to our dedicated revenue for this and the shortfall and how it impacts our overall budget. I just did this anecdotally, and just as far as some direction, Helga, I think maybe it would be good to have this information, a survey of other communities and looking at it. With the exception of Ross's public safety tax, we're already the highest additional tax out there for public safety. I couldn't find a single tax out there that was larger than our existing 986 outside of Ross's $1,100-$1,200. All right.
Yeah, but I'm going to make a comment because I think it's a really important thing.
Well, let me I mean, I get we lose on every economies of scale argument. I mean, our city doesn't work on economies of scale, so we have to have more expenditures. We have to have less efficiency than larger cities. I get that, but it's hard to sort of propose to have twice as much incremental cost above the basic tax than any other community out there for a service that everyone else provides. I think we have a reasonable argument for that, but we have to understand that argument, that that's an outside looking in argument that will come up, we will need to address, and we will need to answer. So it's not enough just to say this is unsustainable for us, because at some point, if it's unsustainable for us, you know, that people don't care, as you're saying, that they're quite happy where they are, and they don't see that. And I think that we will be faced with that down the road from a voting perspective.
Peter, did your analysis take into account that most of the other cities don't have a fire department?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
But they get a direct appropriation of their general tax. So instead of getting 20% of the 1%, they'll get a 9%, 11%, 10%, 12%, 13%, because they're already getting a direct appropriation from to Southern Marin. Yeah, no, it's apples to apples. Where a city keeps their full tax, cities like Larkspur, Ross, Mill Valley, still, because they just did the appropriation, and San Anselmo and Corte Madera, they keep the full, not Corte Madera, not Corte Madera, I'm sorry. They keep the full 18, 19, 20, 21% of their basic tax, which is equivalent to us, but they pay for their fire services from their general fund with, you know, wildfire JPA, with an additional paramedic taxes, with an additional, in some cases, pension taxes. They all have a matrix of other things, but it's not as high as our 983 or Ross's $1,100-$1,200. So we keep that in mind, because we're already at the top end.
Yeah, and I think because the struggle there is that the reason we're in this predicament is because we had a volunteer fire department when the Prop 13 1% was sliced up in the first place.
Yeah.
And so the city got more, but then we introduced a fire tax to fund fire, which was not tied to the expected growth in the fire tax bill. And so we're in this really weird predicament that's not sustainable. But yes.
I mean, John's point about the underlying economics of the Tiburon Fire District, it's unfortunate, and I agree with you that we may not be able to do much about it, in the sense that they're on a revenue model where we're trying to understand things on a cost model. It's just we're missing in the night, but it is something we hopefully can try to address, because at some point it's going to lead to a dissolution of the agreement, because it's just going to become unsustainable unless we choose to charge our residents more via some sort of tax, which we're seeing there's going to be resistance to, and more resistance as school districts start imposing more bond measures and so forth.
I mean, I would say in defense of Tiburon Fire Protection District, they do exactly what we do as a government agency.
No, I'm
which
not
is
saying it's wrong.
Yeah, and they spend it well. They're very well funded on pensions. They do a good job with financial management, and they're just charging us what they charge their citizens. So it's a really hard argument to have unless they really think they're going to lose us as a client. And if we go anywhere else, we need to build a fire station.
Yeah.
So I don't know that we have a lot of firepower to negotiate.
Come back to Peter's point, I think on the communications, my own view would be that you would whoever's charged with this would say that I would not hide the results of this poll. Measure D tried anyway. So I would say we need to do this normal every 4-year renewal. It doesn't address the problem. However, the community is not ready. It doesn't appear to be informed enough, whatever the words, I'm not going to word craft it. And there's a group working on this to explore all options to minimize the impact on our citizens. But we're not ready to come up with a proposal.
Yeah.
In lieu of that, we have to renew whatever this thing is. Otherwise, we're deeper in the hole. So make it crystal clear that, not just saying this isn't a new tax. We say, we've done some work on this. It doesn't appear at the moment because of a multitude of understandable factors. We're working on it. We're going to come back to the community and inform the community about the options that we have fully. In the meantime, we have to do this.
Yeah, normal every 4-year
Maintain
business.
status
Yeah.
quo, right?
Yeah.
That's what next March is all
But I
about.
like the way of framing it in a sense of saying, we're going to come back to you, the community, with options.
Mhm.
Because, I don't want to emphasize, but Rothman's cartoon sort of hit the nail on the head, where he's saying, get taxes, and then we explain why we want the taxes,
Yeah.
rather than the other way around. So I'd put a big effort into that and framing it that way. Yeah. And I think you'd be great at it.
I think you mentioned that so some of the limited opposition that did exist for this. And I think that is a real hangover from Measure D, in that it's a presumption that the tax is happening and we're looking for justification for it, or moving forward in some way. When legitimately, Charles and everyone who was putting this together was really just trying to get a sense of what it looks like out there, dipping our toe in the water and trying to understand, in the absence of any further communication, in the absence of any further education, is this a hill too far? And it's clearly at this point in time a hill too far.
Yeah, exactly.
But does the recommendation include staff over time, finance committee looking at how we reduce, where we make cost savings? Because that has to be,
I would think that's one of the options.
that has to be
Yeah.
part of the long-term.
And I think that's where you start to build the case about, okay, where do we cut?
Right.
And then you can make a case that, capital budget's at a minimum, this is at a minimum, as you put it, we're incredibly lean.
Right.
But then it's in context of looking at everything, not just saying, well, we're going to cut the police.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to me when you're looking at the survey that the biggest gripe was about planning and building and processing of that. And that's lack of resources.
Exactly.
That's lack of IT, that's lack of resources to be able to do it better. And so everything is not running as well as it did a decade ago when we had more resources, but the train isn't falling off the tracks. And so unless you're having direct interaction with the city over things like planning and building, you really don't see that there's been a dilution of services yet. The police department is still just at the level where there's 24/7 service. So they're not seeing it, but we're seeing every year City Council and the Finance Committee struggling more and more where to fund pensions, make the reserve requirements, and have to make choices.
Couldn't agree more, because I think casting the net widely, saying, like you were saying, the planning and, it's having been through with just a recent with a neighbor, it's completely stretched. And the staff are not complying with our own policies. And I'm not blaming the staff. They don't have the time. No, we have a policy and the staff are not complying with it. Therefore, the client's not complying with it. Client gets upset, understandably. But I mean, it's not because of the staff's fault. It's because we don't have the capacity. So I think by broadening it and saying, look, we've got police, we've got planning, we've got tons of issues, and they're all going to get worse unless we have a structural fix.
I think another important point to make, which I think is we're pretty unique in Belvedere, is that part of the reason the city keeps going is because the enormous amount of volunteer hours that people put in to keeping the city going, because we can't afford the staff.
Right.
And so if all those volunteers back away, people will see very quickly what our bare bones city looks like. No offense, Robert. They do an excellent job, but they just don't have the manpower.
It's not enough of them. Yeah.
There's also, and
It's your scale issue.
we've had this conversation a little bit before, more in the planning building side of things, that John certainly made this point that our budget, broadly speaking, is fungible. And that in this case, what I'm about to mention, our size of city is probably a benefit, definitely a benefit, in that there might be, and I don't know the legalities of this, but there might be an opportunity to think about impact type structures, whether it's fees or whether it's incremental costs, that could be identified to support other parts of our budget that will become more fungible for these type services which are required, because we're always going to have a problem from communications, from an additional commitment of tax revenue when this service isn't going away, right? It's not something that is absolutely, it's required. I mean, no city council is going to vote to reduce or eliminate a fire service for the community. So it's the hammer is in a sense decreased services somewhere, which is difficult and challenging and hard to communicate, as Charles talked about. It makes a simple, you talk about Measure M with the open space up there. It's a simple proposition, right? It's, preserving open space for your kids and for your family. That's simple. It's nicely, it's nice connotation that works. This is messy and ugly.
The details of that are gray.
No, I know. To be sure, as far as, but that wasn't the message.
That wasn't the message.
That's behind the scenes and beneath the surface. As clean as our beneath the surface might be, we're going to have a messy message, which will potentially doom this. So are there other things that, because of the scale of our city, we have significant construction projects well above the average from a median sort of home price perspective. We have lots of things that we do in this city that could potentially generate some revenue that would, I know it's still more cost, but if it's specifically identified to cover this increasing cost, I mean, it might be something that's more palatable to the community than a broad tax overall.
Well, to some extent, didn't we do that 2 years ago, particularly in planning, but I think building as well, is looked at what the other cities were charging and what we were doing. I don't know.
Yes, specific to road closures, encroachment permits, things like that. We did analysis and up some of those slightly.
Yeah.
I think the takeaway is whatever you're charging in terms of a fee has to be directly linked to the project itself. So for example, road impact, you have to show and be able to prove that a project's road impact was directly linked to that project. If it's just, we're saying generally we need more money for road improvements throughout the city, I think that's where it starts getting sticky.
Yeah.
And I remember
As
when
somebody who sits here who hasn't done the construction yet, I would be a no vote on increasing fees in that space. I'm just transparent here.
I remember when we were in the early stages of looking at Measure D and potential funding for the critical infrastructure project, we looked at alternative taxes. And clearly there was nothing else that could get us to that level of taxation revenue. But we did touch on utility user taxes, which is about the only other thing as a city with no retail that we could, I think, realistically look at, because we're already maxed out on most fees. But it's definitely worth doing. It's definitely worth looking at whether there's any scope to increase fees and revenues elsewhere.
But I think that's to your point. I think we may be fishing in an empty stream, but I think the voters, community, would want to know that we've looked at everything. Right? We're not just saying, oh shit, we've got a fire tax problem, let's just increase the fire tax. No, we've looked across the board. 2 years ago, we did a survey, we increased fees. I mean, I think that's the important part. What you're saying is you need to reassure the community that we've looked under every rock, and there's nothing big enough to fix $1 million problem. Unless, I mean, the benefit is a slow burn. The benefit of not doing anything is you have a gradual further decline in services, how broadly defined. That's your option. I mean, there isn't a magic bullet here because
It's not really a benefit, it's actually a negative because
Yes.
it's the cooking frog analogy. You just
Yeah.
don't realize how much worse it's getting.
I wanted to just touch on something David said, because I know there's lots of discussion as to whether the fire tax burden or the fire tax deficit is really that much of an issue. And it's hard to look at our budgets on a trend basis because some years the fire tax suddenly jumps up and some years, it's less and we've got other revenues coming in or other expenses. Once you clean all that up, and we can certainly share that, once you clean everything up, when you look at our structural budget, that trend is going up. There's no way to argue that the fire tax deficit is not growing within our budget. There might be odd years where it looks, you can match, you can do a cherry pick and say this is the same as that, but on a trend basis, there's no way that you can make that argument.
yeah,
Um,
there's a structural problem that we have to fix.
Yeah. And I
And I
mean,
think it's going to take a hell of an education of the community and demonstrating that we've cast the net as broadly as possible to solve it without increasing taxes. And that's going to take a while because of where we're starting from with some negativity around other measures. So,
yeah,
I would, to your point, Bob, in terms of this discrete action, I mean, we need to have some team putting together a communication strategy to just renew the current tax. If it's March 24, it's not a lot of time. So we need, I don't know who decides this, town council, I don't know if it's the council or the finance, I don't know who it is, but someone's got to say, okay, let's get to work on this and start getting out there and communicating. That's my own view.
How deep, Helga, Robert, have you planned to present this beyond this committee? City council or report the findings?
Just through city council so far, potentially on September 11th or in October.
Would there be a separate agenda item talking about at least a timetable or a discussion briefly on the override for March of 24 and what's involved? And I believe it's the same December deadline. And then, so everyone on the council certainly, but in the community as well, knows what would be the approval process, and then at what point it gets handed off to a communications committee, as John was discussing.
Yeah, we'll be doing that same analysis and determining what the best timing is. I'm not sure if that's in September or October, but it will be, probably sometime this fall.
I think the sooner the better, and the more
Yeah.
clarity as far as what that means. It's no new tax. It's the same override that we've done 5 times. We're looking to, basically get the authorization to spend it, and here's what it means.
Yeah, Helga reminded me too, as part of the communications for the finance committee, we're planning on getting an email out to the community tomorrow, which does have a reminder in there, really a summary of what we're talking about now, the conclusions of the polling, and then the reminder that there is a separate measure that's going to be on the ballot in March, not related to this, just like you're saying. So, yeah, thank you, Helga. That'll be the first outreach.
I'm sorry, did you say that's going out tomorrow?
Tomorrow morning, and then it'll also be posted on our website.
Are there any conclusions that this committee is making as far as this? You're just talking about the top line results.
Yes, that's true.
Has anyone reviewed it, Helga, other than staff?
Yeah, we've reviewed it internally and worked with Sally Wilkinson on the messaging, and the mayor is reviewing it as well.
And it'll be updated based on whatever recommendations the committee makes this evening.
Sally, is there anything in it that after this discussion today, you might rethink what you say
no,
tomorrow?
because I mean, Charles has read it too. I think the only change in the recommendations is the de-emphasis of police and just generally looking at services generally. And depending what the finance committee decides, obviously activation of conversation with Tiburon Fire Protection District is important as a minimum in terms of the contract. I don't know how how people feel about annexation. But I do think it's sort of the elephant in the room, because people who read this who don't understand much will be like, well, why the hell don't you renegotiate with Tiburon Fire Protection District? And so I do think it's important to have it in there that we're doing that work. We're doing what we can to reduce costs, but we're very constrained in terms of what we can do. So I don't know what the Finance Committee wants to make in terms of the recommendation of what those negotiations with Tiburon Fire should look like at this stage. And Helga made a point, which is our contract, we've got a 2-year notice on our contract anyway. And so any contract term renegotiations presumably won't take effect for 2 years anyway.
So on the email tomorrow, I thought based on what Helga said, it's just here are the results. And next spring, there's this measure which is completely unrelated. I think that's fine. If we start talking about renegotiations or having to look at it and what it might mean for police, I think we'll confuse people. I think the discussion around what comes next, we want to postpone until next year. So that the focus of communication between now and March is really just to make sure that the budget override gets approved.
So if
In
it's
parallel, we should do the approaching the annexation, looking at the contract, and all the other things that we discussed. I think those are the 2 big ones in addition to the communication.
So perhaps the only caveat I'd say is that having done the survey, certain portion of the population are thinking about an increase in the fire tax. So somehow, having raised this, my own view would be you have to, if we hadn't have done it, we could do what you're saying, but we've done it. So you have to address it in a way of saying, we're working on that. Yeah,
Yes. we
because
can make one
otherwise, yeah,
sentence
they're going to
assessment,
just slam, they're just going to,
complain that we spend money.
and then
on
they're
the
going to,
survey.
yeah, and they're going to say this is just, so I think, that's why I think, these type of messages need to be, and maybe they have, crafted with a care, because they're on the record and they shape public opinion. So I think, whilst I agree with the simplicity of just rolling over the current tax, having done this survey, we have to say something that we're committed to working on finding an efficient solution to the underlying problem. I mean, even if it's just that, yeah. And we will involve the citizens in whatever that is. I don't know, but you have to have, otherwise, I think it's going to be a bit of a problem.
Yeah, if the
Charles?
message is that we did the survey, people don't like it, we'll continue to investigate it. And that's more or less it, rather than describing how we're going to investigate, because I
Okay.
don't think we're clear on
Yeah.
that yet.
I wouldn't say they don't like it. I would say that, no, I'm just saying.
Results, top line. But you also have to say that that the recommendation is to not make a recommendation for a tax.
Charles, do you want to dig in here and say? what you
Yeah, if I
recommend?
could just offer a little context on this, because I did help craft this email message, and I think it's exactly what you're saying, John, is for those people that took the survey or are aware of the survey results, the email is meant to provide some context. So it provides a brief background on the issue, similar to how Helga started the conversation today, so people even know contextually what we're talking about. Then it talks about the fact that the city conducted the survey, brief mention of the fact that the survey results do not justify moving forward with the tax. So we make clear that. And then it basically finishes by mentioning the fact that, the city will continue investigating different ways to solve this problem aside from an immediate tax increase.
Excellent.
And that the override issue will be likely coming to voters next year. Those are kind of the key message points.
So my perspective is similar, but I don't know that people are going to read that far. It kind of reminds me of, the read my lips, no new taxes. So I think, and again, this is not my expertise, but I would say right out front that the recommendation is no new tax at this time. And the survey results were informative and will be considered as in the future as the city reviews this embedded problem and makes the most efficient analysis type thing. But you got to say right up front, no new tax.
I
And,
think-
that somehow just tie that to the fact that next year it'll be, renewed, but no new tax.
And do-
I don't disagree with that, David, but there's a really question, who's saying that?
Recommendation.
Of this finance committee?
I think so. That's.
Yeah, I mean, the city council didn't mean, so they can't say anything. So it's either a message, a recommendation from this finance committee or a message from the city manager, I would assume.
I think
Yeah.
it's what you said, a recommendation from this committee, I would think.
And I think that language probably has to say that the city council will decide next steps, because that isn't a decision of the finance committee, that's a decision of the city council. And that it's going to review that at an coming meeting.
Now, just a recommendation of the citizen-led finance committee.
Yeah.
Is important too.
Is there any need to send this out tomorrow morning? Or, does Monday work? I just have a little concern that it be,
Well, because it's the finance committee that's doing it. You think the finance committee would see it.
And it is, Thursday before Labor Day, to seem a bit of an odd time.
Yeah, what difference does it make? Yeah, you can't have a million people drafting anything, but I would have thought if it comes from the finance committee should see it.
I think we have Brown Act considerations there, don't we? In terms of
Sorry?
share, I think we have Brown Act considerations of sharing a document with an entire finance committee.
Sorry, Ted, I didn't follow.
Outside of a public meeting is what you're referring to.
Yeah.
We'd have to convene a public meeting to review the draft.
Right now and
Unfortunately,
ask for comments.
we could see if the subcommittee, for example, wanted to review that internally before it goes out. That could be an option. I think the idea behind trying to get the message out sooner than later is that we know there's going to be other people talking about this. We want to make sure the city sets. the
No, I
record
think
straight.
sooner, but I mean, like he's saying, Thursday or Tuesday. Makes no difference.
Tuesday does feel, back to business, back home, just,
Yeah,
I mean,
I
literally,
agree.
Labor Day, it's dead, it's school traffic notwithstanding, it's sort of a dead time. It is amazing, just like that school starts, just traffic picks up amazingly.
That's it.
That's why traffic,
Tax-
that's why traffic is the top gripe of our community.
Tax parents dropping off kids at school,
Sorry,
drop off tax.
we've definitely talked about road
Robert,
taxes.
you seemed concerned about that. Does that not
No,
work?
no,
Is
I'm
there-
fine. We had I guess, a strategy going into this just around the communications piece. But I think, like I said, we were trying to get out sooner than later. I don't think Tuesday is going to sink us though, if we wanted to wait that long.
Well, then the next step is a subcommittee, or how do you want to proceed to get input between now and next Tuesday?
Yeah, I think we'd probably meet with the subcommittee if we have time to do that. It's going to be pretty tight. I wanna say it's not a Brown Act meeting, obviously, so we could meet over Zoom and
Can't you just?
Right, and share that
you can't-
document.
Sorry, I don't know the policy. You can't
this
just
point,
email, you can't email it to people and say, here's a draft.
so email it to the entire
don't know, I'm just saying.
finance committee. No.
Let's say,
To
let's
the
say,
subcommittee, yes, we can do that.
you can't email it to the finance committee.
Not the entire committee, no.
The draft.
But couldn't you pass it out at this meeting right now? Because this is a public
A
meeting.
draft of it, then the public would have access to it as
Public
well.
would see it. They
would
have
be
to share it with the
posted.
public.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Oh.
So it'll go to the same fire tax subcommittee that we had.
That's correct, yes.
John,
Yeah, here's something, I mean, Sally's already looked at it, so really it's Patrick and me, right? So you get it to us, whatever comments we do, as a subcommittee draft, the chair would have the right to approve it beyond that as a modified draft, because it's not the same document any longer. Individually to him, and he could approve it as a chair, as the recommendation from the committee.
Bob can join anyway, because there's only two
Yeah.
of the five.
I mean, but if you were to structurally do it steps, right? Draft A, where it is right now, can go to the existing committee.
Yeah.
Patrick, myself, and Sally's already seen it. Our recommendation and comments to Helga get revised into draft B, which is now a separate document that goes to Bob to authorize it and approve it for the committee as a whole, because it's making the recommendation.
I think that's right. Yeah, I'll double check on that, but that sounds like a
like a
strategy we
good
could
idea.
work on.
okay, is everyone in agreement with that plan? only slightly different subject. It seems to me that this conversation we've had has highlighted the importance of four different committees of some sort, maybe same people are, but clearly first priority is stated here, a committee to start dealing with the fire tax override coming up in March of 2024. But it seems like there's also a need to start at some point, sooner rather than later, have a committee that deals with the communications around the bigger issue. It seems that we need to have a committee that is going to focus on discussions with the fire department, both vis-a-vis annexation and the formula. And a fourth one would be to start some kind of long-term budget review of the budget and see, where is the flexibility? Now, I don't think this finance committee is empowered to undertake any of those on its own. So I think we have to look to the city council to say, to what extent do you want the finance department to be involved in any of those, or the city council wants a different committee to deal with those? But if one were to summarize the discussion we've had here for the last 45 minutes or so, it seems like those are the four key issues that we've identified. But ultimately, it's up to the city council to decide, all right, how do we want to pursue each of those four issues?
So the fire measure next March, it's like it was for Measure D and everything else. As soon as it's put on the ballot, it has to be a citizen committee. So that would be a very short-term committee to do any communications around that.
And that's why I mentioned to Robert about what laying out that timetable, because I would hope and think that the mayor or the vice mayor very, very shortly will attempt to recruit a citizens committee based on the timetable to get item 1 in your list checked off.
Yep.
Sorry, Bob, I have to go. I have a Zoom doctor thing. I'm better go and do that. Thanks a lot. I agree with your summary.
Is there any reason not to have the existing subcommittee begin communications contract-wise, annexation formula-wise with Tiburon Fire Department continue?
Seems like that would be the ideal group to do it.
If John,
if he rejoins,
if he would like to
because he
rejoin, yeah.
seems more interested than anybody else on the annexation discussions.
I can talk to him about that, see if he would like to rejoin for that narrow scope as that committee.
But ultimately, it's still the city council.
Oh, to be sure, but
it
it
has to make that final call.
Yeah, to authorize that communication.
To authorize any of the subcommittees. To authorize any of it goes to the city council.
Even an ad hoc committee like that? That wasn't an ad hoc committee, that was a subcommittee.
Chair McCaskill, I just want to point out, before we make any final recommendations today, we should call for public comment.
Public comment.
Public comment.
Can we do that right now?
Ready, yes.
All right. Can we open the floor for any public comments?
Yes, we do have one hand raised from Bill Rothman. I'll allow him to talk. And Bill, whenever you're ready, you have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
No. Hold up, Bill.
Hang on a second.
We can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Not yet.
I don't know why that would be. My microphone is not muted.
Bill, they're working on it.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me now?
It's getting slightly better, but let's wait and see if they their Bill.
Hello?
Yeah, we hear you, Bill. Hang on.
Oh, you do hear me? I'm sorry.
Hang tight for just a minute, Bill. We can hear you, but it's really hard to hear you. So we're trying to work on the volume on our end. Hang tight. We'll tell you when we're ready.
Is it any better?
They're still working on it, Bill. Hang on.
No, I was just seeing to test whether it has been solved. That's all. Thank you.
Robert, you want to try to hold the mic up to it? Okay.
Hey, Bill, if you can hear me, try speaking now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, oh, thank you very much. I think that it's very important for you to recognize that they're the opposite arguments, because otherwise you could go marching to a ballot initiative without really understanding what people were feeling. I understand from what the guest said that there were 250 responses. 250 responses, I believe there's 1,600 voters in Belvedere. Now, I'm not sure what that means, but it's hardly an overwhelming, it's like 1/7 or something of the people who you asked to respond even bothered to respond. I don't know whether that means that they're happy with the idea or they couldn't understand the survey or what the story was, but I'm not sure that one would consider it a representative. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure the expert on surveys would know more, but it certainly was not an overwhelming support of the tax. I also think that it's very important for you to recognize that if something is said and then somebody goes back on it, then that counts for a lot in these days when, as Measure D showed, there are other ways of communicating with the public other than what the city government says. For instance, in the staff report, it says that the police force has had to be reduced from 9 to 6 because of not enough money. On the other hand, I have raised the issue of whether they should have 7 and whether they should fund the unfunded position that was approved. And over again, the city council has told me and told the public, we have an adequate police force. We don't need any more police. Well, that's going to cause an issue in voters' minds. Please be aware of it if someone should say, oh yeah, we say we don't have enough police. In addition, the amount of money from the general fund that's going to the fire and the EMS is just 12% of the general fund. Most people would feel, boy, it ought to be 15, 16, maybe 20%, because what an important service that is. Now, as to the sources of revenue, I think an argument could be made that it isn't even necessary to do anything for 2 things I point to you. There's tremendous new construction taking place. Many of us old folks are dying or moving away or whatever. I pay about $3,500, no, well, with the undergrounding, I pay about $7,000 a year. The people down the street in tax, that's with the undergrounding. The people down the road pay about $80,000. The new requirements for new housing from the state, you're going to have 160 new units or be in deep trouble. And if you have 160 new units, that's going to increase your general fund tremendously. General fund revenue is derived from property taxes, as you know, and that property taxes are based to a significant degree on the ability of the people to pay. Whereas parcel taxes, the poor pay as much, and there are some people who aren't that well off, elderly, fixed incomes, etc., and that they're taxed at the same rate as someone who's got a house for $20 million. That doesn't feel good to people. But again, I think that the increased property values, the very soon increased property taxes that are going to be coming, and 17% of it, as you know, comes back to the city, may very well make it unnecessary to do anything. And the general fund will increase, and an argument can be made, and would be made if there was an attempt to put this on the ballot, an argument could be made that it's unnecessary. And again, you'll note in the staff report that there's a statement that there's no urgency about this budget situation. It's written down. It's in black and white. Finally, I think that the fact that a survey was done before the people were educated, before there were community meetings, I think that doesn't feel good to people. And then when in the staff report it says that was the order of things, survey for a new tax before education, the argument in the staff report is that knowing the information that would come from the education would, I'm quoting the staff report, would bias people's responses. It might lead them to feel it isn't such a good idea to have a tax, but to call that from the information that they gain, knowledge is power. From the information that they gain, they might decide not. But I would hardly consider that bias. At any rate, I very much appreciate the efforts that everybody is putting into this. But quite frankly, I'm not at all sure there's a problem. Thank you very much.
Chair, can I just make a quick, hey, Bill, Helga, correct me if I'm wrong, but the, in the 23-24 budget, the fire cost for Tiburon is 21% of our gross revenue. It's not 12%, just
Yeah, I wondered about that.
give you a sense of that.
Any other public comment, Robert?
Seeing none at this time.
Okay, we'll close the floor to further public comment, come back to this committee. Any other thoughts this committee has going forward? I guess to the two members of the city council, is it clear to you for communication to the city council what this committee believes at this point?
Yes, I think so, but we should, confer afterwards to make sure that you agree with
Okay.
with that. But I think this is now a discussion for the city council in terms of what they feel the next steps should be.
Okay. And the subcommittee that's going to try to do something between now and Tuesday, the two of you and.
If you can get us the letter, the draft, we'll get comments back to you independently. I think that's how it has to happen. And then you can consolidate and deliver to Bob over the weekend, hopefully, to
Yes,
give his recommendation.
yes,
Okay.
I can send that to you and Patrick.
You don't need a motion for the recommendation, no, it's just a verbal discussion.
Yeah, that's fine for now.
I also think Bob's list of 4 things, I don't know that that's, I won't say it, I'll say in the positive. I think that's a good verbal, if not formal, recommendation of this committee to city council that obviously certainly a citizens committee needs to focus on this, that the broader long-term perspective of this issue, the diminishing revenue versus cost, alternate tax options, and certainly the fungible aspect of the budget, how we need to look at potential cuts should this not be the case, should be looked at, and direction from city council should be provided to whomever would do those necessary investigations.
I'd love to hear from Charles whether that's a good idea or a bad idea.
Sorry, specifically that enumerating those 4.
Yeah,
goals.
right now.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think that some of this needs to be done sequentially, right? There needs to be an announcement that comes out of this meeting to make clear that there is not an immediate pursuit of the fire tax increase, right? Subsequent to that, there needs to be a focus on the GAN limit override. And then from there, I think that the communications can start. Behind the scenes planning can certainly occur, but I think publicly, in terms of how information is rolled out, it does need to follow that sequence, or else I think you risk confusion.
Yeah, certainly, Sally. I'm not suggesting they're a September 15th project moving forward, but just that this committee is recommending through this process, through this subcommittee, and through this discussion, here are the things that need to happen going forward at some point in time. And as Bob pointed out, this committee is not authorized to do them independently. And that I think to John's point, prior to him leaving, it shows that this committee and the city as a whole, there's no stone unturned. We're looking to make sure that everything we're doing is to further improve the economics of the city, provide good services for the community, and to make sure that we're doing it in the most, deliberate, intelligent way possible.
Yeah. And Charles, to be clear, any recommendations from this finance committee aren't going to be in the newspaper next week. Nobody pays that much attention to what this committee does. They pay attention to what the city council does. So these are just four, as Peter said, recommendations for the city council to take into consideration.
Yeah, I mean, I think as an outgrowth of this meeting, it's fine that those be priorities for future consideration. I guess just in terms of the real work unfolding and how that impacts the public, you just want to be mindful of that timeline.
And by no means is this in that letter. Right. I mean,
Correct.
I believe it informs a staff report, if not September, but in the future.
Okay. Any further discussions on this or any other business that anyone wants us to consider today? If not, we are adjourned at 2 minutes till 5. Thank you.